Good morning. Hello, I'm Lisa Dempster. I'm the director of the Melbourne Writers Festival. Welcome to our first day. I would like to acknowledge that this event is being held on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nations and acknowledge our elders past and present. It seems fitting that today, on the first full day of the Melbourne Writers Festival, we're presenting this remarkable one-day conference tackling the big literary topics of our day. Melbourne Writers Festival is presenting this conference in partnership with the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council as part of the Great Britain Arts 13. To introduce today's conference, I would like to welcome to the stage from the British Council, Kirsten Freeman.
Hello and welcome. And I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Bunwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation, their ancestors and elders, who are part of the longest continuing culture in the world. What a momentous day today is, the culmination of not only 12 months of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, but back to 1962 and the seminal, aka fierce, rowdy and raucous, International Writers' Conference in Edinburgh. Just a little bit of history about how we got to today. In August 2012, the British Council and the Edinburgh International Book Festival launched this Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, an ambitious idea of a world conference to involve authors from across the planet. It also commemorated 50 years since that 1962 International Writers' Conference in Edinburgh, the first of its kind, that attracted a huge audience, filling the 2,300-seat McEwen Hall in Edinburgh every day for 5 days. The line-up included Norman Mailer, Henry Miller, Mary McCarthy, William Burroughs, Muriel Spark, Lawrence Durrell, Stephen Spender, Eric Fried and Khushwant Singh, amongst others. Leading up to the conference, organiser publisher John Calder told the press, we are imposing no prohibitions on the free expression of opinion, however controversial or unusual. And by all accounts, and you can read them online, that's what ensued. Over the last 12 months around the world, this Edinburgh World Writers' Conference has explored the same 5 themes as 1962 in 15 cities with over 270 writers. It has been to Germany, South Africa, Russia, Turkey, Belgium, China and many others, and now finally here, the final stop in Melbourne. As the discussion rolls around the globe, Edinburgh World Writers' Conference has a parallel life online, and the highlights will be published in a landmark book later on this year. The aim has been to build the most complete picture of writing and its relationship to our lives ever attempted. It's our hope that more than ever, leading writers from diverse languages and cultures will be given a powerful international voice to debate what matters most at this time. This extraordinary undertaking by the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council is only possible with support from Creative Scotland, Edinburgh Festival Expo Fund and the City of Edinburgh Council, and of course Melbourne Writers Festival. The wonderful Lisa Dempster has shown huge enthusiasm for the idea right from the beginning and is the curator of the feast that we have awaiting us today. And finally, to the writers, those here today and those who've gone before. Thank you.
Thank you, that was beautiful and a good introduction to today, I think. As Kirsten said, after 1 year on the road, Melbourne Writers Festival is the final stop for this conference tour. And when I say we, I mean Mike Shuttleworth and I, who actually put this program together, and we're both going to be here all day. We thought this would be a great opportunity not just to take part in the conference's global discussion about the contemporary state of literature today, but to also look forward and to ask where next for writing. I'm also really proud that we're showcasing some of Australia's best writing talent alongside our fabulous international guests. And as well as those taking part on stage here today, we have a couple of rows of delegates of writers at the front who are here representing a wide diversity of writing styles and platforms. Today's conference events are 75 minutes long because we really wanted to encourage discussion and debate. Our hashtags, for those of us who are on social media, are MWF13 and World Writers Conf. I'd now like to welcome to the stage our first event for today, Alizadeh, Larissa Behrendt and John Burnside. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Alizadeh, and I'll be the chair for this great session, which is the Edinburgh Writers' Festival conference session, Censorship Today, Censorship Tomorrow. I'd also first like to acknowledge the Kulin Nations and the elders past and present. And I would also like to, in addition to reiterating that this session is being presented in partnership with the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council, I would also like to draw your attention that this event features an empty chair, over there, the white chair. It symbolizes the writers who cannot be here at events such as this because they are being imprisoned or silenced. Melbourne Writers' Festival supports the work of International Pen and the use of empty chair as a symbol of the political work the organization carries out on behalf of writers around the world. International Pen Melbourne works on behalf of writers who are imprisoned, tortured, threatened, attacked, or exiled for the peaceful practice of their professions. The empty chair on the stage represents a writer who could not be here because of these circumstances. I'm just going to give you a quick sort of rundown of what's going to be happening in our session today, and then we will get on with the session. After, I'll do my little introduction and introduce our first speaker, Professor Larissa Behrendt, who will give us the keynote speech. We will then have a discussion with the three of us, myself, Larissa, and John Burnside, and after that there will be some questions from the delegates of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, and then we'll open to questions from everyone in the audience. The keynote will be given by Professor Larissa Behrendt. She is a lawyer, academic, and writer. Her novels explore issues concerning Indigenous life and families. She's also written on a range of issues such as films and political themes to do with Indigenous life and general political and cultural concerns. Larissa is going to give us her own interpretation of the topic, which is censorship today and censorship tomorrow. So please make her feel very welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to pay my respects to the Kulin Nation, on whose land I'm going to be speaking today, and my deep thanks to the Melbourne Aboriginal community who've always made me feel so welcome whenever I've been visiting down here from Sydney. I'd also like to thank Lisa for inviting me to give the keynote today, which she kind of had to talk me into a little bit, so I was a bit reluctant at first, but she was very convincing, and here I am, so thank you, Lisa, I think. And I'd also like to acknowledge the other writers in the room today who are a great supportive community, and of course acknowledge the people who love reading books, because without you, where would we be? As Ali said, you'll be pleased to know that as a lawyer I'm not going to give a strong legal interpretation of the theme today. How boring would that be? But my starting point is really one of my favourite images, most powerful images in a recent Australian novel that really stayed with me. At the end of Kate Grenville's novel, The Secret River, there's a very powerful image of a colonial mansion, the new home of the ex-convict turned wealthy landowner, William Thornhill and his family, being built on a rock that has a sacred Aboriginal carving of a whale in it. The house, of course, represents the wealth of the new settlers, those who've conquered the Australian landscape, made their fortune and built their future here. The foundations of the house are the Aboriginal people and their culture. The power of Grenville's metaphor is that she preserves the Aboriginal presence and connection to land. It's not destroyed in the face of the oncoming colonisation. It's buried. although it's hidden, one day, when the civilization eventually crumbles, the rock will be, with its carved etching, will once more be revealed, the ancient connection to land still continuing. It's easy when thinking of censorship to think first of legal definitions, but for me, Grenville's image evokes a broader, more complex reflection on concepts of silencing, one that goes beyond the arbitrary and shifting concepts within the dominant legal system. What lies hidden beneath and unseen, like the foundations under a stone house, is also silenced. Winners vanquish losers, we all know they write history, but each instance of conquest has its own historical peculiarities, its own legacies. And within these historically distinct events and repercussions are a multitude of experiences, a plethora of stories. Some of these stories triumph and become canonical. Others are suppressed, handed down from parent to child, transmitted amongst subgroups and subcultures, but outside the dominant national narrative. The capacity of Indigenous people to tell their own stories was impeded in several complicating ways as part of the process of the colonisation of Australia. As an oral culture, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures relied upon transmission from generation to generation through stories, ceremony, dance, music, and art. The high mortality rates from introduced diseases, the processes of dispossession, dislocation, and relocation, and the policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families are all factors that made the continuing transmission of these oral traditions difficult, especially in the areas where colonisation was most aggressive. And secondly, while the removal of Aboriginal children was supposed to give them the advantages of the dominant culture, education levels were appalling, and Aboriginal young people, no matter what their talents, were earmarked for manual labour. Boys were to work on cattle stations, girls were to work as domestic servants. Among all of the insidious ways that peoples can be colonised, denying them the tools that allow them to communicate in the imposed and dominant culture is one of the most effective and disenfranchising. It disempowers and continually marginalises an already marginalised group. Literacy rates in Australia amongst Indigenous people have gradually improved, but even today there is a large gap between the literacy rates of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students emerges very early. Non-Indigenous students outperform Indigenous students in benchmark tests for reading, writing and numeracy from Year 3, increase in Year 5, increase even more in Year 7, and the gap keeps widening, even more so for numeracy and competencies in science. As Indigenous children get older and the gap widens, we see this all the way up until entrance into university and tertiary education. Indigenous people make up 2.2% of the population in the age groups that can access higher education, yet Indigenous students make up only 1.3% of the student numbers. And while 82% of Australian students enter their tertiary education through their previous educational attainments, going straight from high school into university, only 46% of Indigenous students today enter university this way. The gaps in their earlier education mean that Indigenous students often have to do additional studies to be able to enter university. And it's not a matter of the students not being clever enough for tertiary studies, but they were denied the shortest pathway and come to university studies and other tertiary studies later in life and through a more circuitous route. The resilience of living cultures must frustrate those hell-bent on assimilation or achieving a cultural hegemony. Attempts to assimilate, no matter how extreme or how subtle, often have the completely opposite effect. They further bind an identified and persecuted group through a shared suffering and its associated experiences and trauma. Discrimination only succeeds in reinforcing difference, in testing attachment to culture, and reinforces a sense of identity. Attempts to reintroduce marginalised voices into the dominant culture are not always welcome. My grandmother was removed under the policy of removing children from their parents, and her experiences as a ward of the state and my father's childhood in an orphanage inspired my first novel, Home. Growing up in Sydney, I was surrounded by other children, well-meaning but innocently ignorant of these historical practices of separating Aboriginal children from their families and its broader policy of assimilation. Their views were sometimes crudely racist and often lacking in empathy, and I'd always thought that if Australian children were taught this history, it would increase the understanding of the issues facing Indigenous people, and even if it did not win people over to the Indigenous point of view, at least it would explain why Indigenous people face the issues we face and why we have the political agenda that we have. But the response to the publication of the Bringing Them Home report, the detailed national investigation into the extent and impact of the child removal policy, was instructive and sobering to me. The official response was to dismiss the report by saying it was only 1 in 10 Indigenous children that were removed, that the term cultural genocide used in the report was too emotive, and that whatever the report concluded, the motivation for the removal of children was often done with the best of intentions and for the best interests of the children involved. Aboriginal poet, novelist and historian Tony Birch wrote this of the response to the Bringing Them Home report. Indigenous communities across Australia have become the memory bank of white Australia's violence by proxy. It is time for white Australia to take over that responsibility. Perhaps it is time to make an ethical withdrawal of responsibility. Such a need has become more acute in recent years with the outcome of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Bringing Them Home report, providing an opportunity for white Australia to take ownership of its colonial past in a more than selective manner. Unfortunately, the backlash against Bringing Them Home has been more substantive than any acceptance of and responsibility for the colonial violence that it has provided testament to. It was the delivery of the report that motivated the most ferocious elements of the history war, an orchestrated campaign conducted by the right in Australia against the legitimacy of Indigenous memory. Birch's observations resonate with me and are a reminder that these history wars or culture wars that waged amongst academics and writers of opinion pieces may have argued the semantics and the numbers in the halls of universities and the pages of broadsheets, but like the stone hidden under William Thornhill's house, the lived experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples affected by those policies remained unchanged by those debates. The ideological battle was not really about Aboriginal history. It was about the competing narratives that non-Indigenous Australians want to tell about themselves. And this reaction, which included the official government response, showed me that I was wrong to believe that hearing the stories of people who had suffered under the removal policy would be the pathway to the better understanding of Indigenous history and culture. The response was much more complex than that, and what it did show was that evidence in its most human form can be so powerful that it is simply too confronting, and the easier way to deal with it for some people is to attempt to silence it, dismiss it by falling back to the contested statistics, or distract from it with semantic debates. The reaction does, however, give testament to the power of stories. The Bringing Them Home report was littered with extracts of testimony, not just from those taken away, but from the parents, grandparents and siblings left behind. So many government reports are written after investigations, contemplation of the research and a list of sensible recommendations to address the problem, only to sit on shelves, gather dust and fade into the mists of bureaucratic memory. What challenged people more than any legal or historical argument made in the report, what made it so dangerous to those who felt so challenged, was the power of that human testimony, the power of their stories. George R.R. Martin, the author of the now culturally iconic Game of Thrones, wrote in another of his novels, A Clash of Kings, that When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say. And I particularly think the response to the Bringing Them Home report has some resonance for that sentiment. The impact of the removal policy has been a strong theme through much Indigenous writing, not surprising since it's formed such a large part of contemporary Indigenous experience. Sally Morgan's My Place and Doris Pilkington's Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence are quintessential examples of this, and the response to the Philip Noyce film adapting Pilkington's book to the screen was met with a similar response to the Bringing Them Home report, predictably from the same quarters. Telling these stories is not just an essential part of Indigenous culture. Love of stories is instinctive and primal to all human beings. So it's no surprise that there is a vibrant creative drive within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia to continue to tell these stories. The renaissance of Indigenous writing, which has been driven by writers such as Tony Birch, Alexis Wright, Ali Cobby Eckermann, Kim Scott, and a plethora of others, has been accompanied by other Indigenous storytellers using other mediums. Stephen Page and his work through the Bangarra Dance Theatre, Wesley Enoch and his work on the stage, the rise to eminence of of Indigenous art, whose aesthetics point to ancient connections to country, the new wave of Indigenous filmmaking, including Ivan Sen and Warwick Thornton, and the establishment of a free-to-air national Indigenous television. These are all new technologies that have been adopted for the telling of our most ancient stories. So coming from this perspective, it might seem natural that I would blindly embrace the concept of the right to free speech. But I think it's more complicated than that. An essential part of any rights culture and of any human rights framework is the complex balancing of rights. I believe that free speech is important, but like any other right, needs to be balanced with others, including the right to be free from racial discrimination, the right to due process before the law, and the right to equality before the law. Where the line is drawn should be the debate of a healthy and inclusive participatory democracy. Observing the psychological and emotional scars of racism enacted as policy or disseminated through popular culture and political narrative, I'm wary of blanket claims of absolute rights, suspicious of extremes demanded by a dominant culture that has often championed well its own interests, not those of the groups it has marginalised. The heightened precedence given to the right of free speech against other rights is a particularly American value, but also symptomatic of the way that other civil and political rights are often given precedence over economic, social and cultural rights. For marginalised and culturally distinct groups, exclusion from economic and social participation and freedom of cultural expression are perhaps valued more and seen as being of equal importance to the civil and political rights that more easily engage members of dominant cultures and political elites. Besides the notion that any society supports the concept of free speech, we need to consider that the approach to that unfettered right is often absurd. It's always regulated, rightly, in relation to issues such as defamation and libel, and it is also regulated rightly in relation to trade practices to ensure that consumers are not duped by unsubstantiated claims. In those contexts, free speech doesn't exist, so to claim that we have unfettered or should have unfettered rights is simply ludicrous. I find it difficult to support blanket statements about the concept of censorship as well. For me, the arguments about where to draw the lines are in theory slippery and contradictory. Of more interest and of more importance is the general question of what is it that we're seeking to censor and why. When the censorship is one where the weight of the dominant culture is used to silence dissenting views and to silence the marginalised, I think it raises a complex set of moral and ethical questions that can't be easily unpicked, but should be. And I don't pretend to know where that line is, but I do believe that the balancing of the right to free speech against other rights is one of the ongoing conversations in a healthy participatory democracy. And this might sound a bit utopian, but I say this as someone who is inherently suspicious of the way dominant culture laws work and where they sometimes draw the line. The fact that the dominant culture often gets to decide that line is also problematic, but it doesn't mean it should go unchallenged. Its adjudicators are never without their own cultural bias, even though they often assume that they are and can be objective about such matters. But I do not think the discussion about where these lines are drawn should be a closed one. It needs to be open, honest and fluid, and needs to include voices that are often marginalised within the dominant culture. It strikes me that one of the deepest cultural differences between Indigenous culture in Australia and the dominant Australian culture is around the concept of knowledge. Within the spiritual life of Aboriginal societies, there was a clear delineation about knowledge holding. There were issues that were men's business and women's business, and the concept of secret and sacred knowledge, which only the custodians or the initiated were entitled to know. This concept that there is information that you're not permitted to know is one that sits uncomfortably with European intellectual traditions. But it remains the case today across Australia that there is still knowledge, images, practices and artefacts that remain sacred to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and cannot be shared. And in this context, notions of censorship raise very interesting and difficult, complex questions. Respecting that, I do not, however, ascribe to the view that non-Indigenous people can never write from the perspective of Indigenous people. Writers with talent can write from any perspective, but the trick is to get the authenticity, the truth of the situation, the characters, and the essence of the interaction. The challenge in crossing any divide, gender, religious, or cultural, is that unless the writer can stand in the shoes of the character, can adeptly interpret the perspective, the writing will ring hollow and will ring untrue. In this way, Indigenous writers are advantaged. They better understand, by virtue of their interaction with the dominant culture, the views from the other side of the cultural divide. But it has always challenged Australian writers, even writers of great skill, to be able to interpret well the world of Indigenous people. This is not because it's impossible, but just because the level of understanding needed to write authentically is so deep that the general ignorance of Indigenous culture often makes the translation a challenge for those seeking to interpret it from outside. Patrick White, one of our greatest writers, meditated on the perspectives of Indigenous people within Australian culture in several of his books. He did so reflectively in Riders of the Chariot and Voss, but was much less successful in his novel inspired by the shipwreck of Eliza Fraser in the 1860s. A Fringe of Leaves was inspired by that story, and during the heroine's time amongst the Aborigines, she becomes closer to her more natural state, and as part of this psychological reconnection, engages in a ceremony that includes an act of cannibalism. Instead of understanding that there was no such practice of cannibalism within Indigenous communities in Australia, White buys into this myth and thus perpetuates it, but seeks to excuse it by using the act of consumption of flesh as a metaphor for our most primitive desires, the instincts our society represses. White paints the Aboriginal people in this novel in the classic noble savage role. I've argued elsewhere that the depiction of Aboriginal people in this romanticised state is as unhelpful and dangerous as the portrayal of Aboriginal people as savages. Grenville avoids this trap in The Secret River. She tells the story of William Thornhill's conquest of his land and the Aboriginal people who lived there without romanticism. Her novel also tells the story of Aboriginal people, but she chose to do this not by creating an Indigenous character to guide us through this perspective, but by telling us the same story from the unsympathetic viewpoint of a white Australian who sees Aboriginal people fearfully. He is fearful they will retaliate, fearful they will fight, that they will challenge. And through the eyes of such a character, she says so much with deep truth about the underlying unease which not only pervades the contemporary relationship between Aboriginal people and the dominant culture. It also explains why so much unease and conflict remains amongst the dominant culture about the way in which they tell the story of their own history. For a writer, this is a deft skill, but I want to conclude by celebrating what uncensored, unself-conscious writing can achieve even when it misses the mark. Another great Australian novelist is Thomas Keneally. Of his enviable body of work sits a book, The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, written in the 1970s, when Australia was confronting a new political era in its relationship with Indigenous people. At that time, Aboriginal people were influenced by the civil rights movement in the United States, created their own Black Power movement here, and gave birth to the modern land rights movement. And along with this emerged a new kind of Aboriginal activist. Keneally's novel is inspired by the outlaw Jimmy Governor and explores the inevitable consequences of trapping a young Aboriginal man between the ambitions available to white people and the discrimination against his own black skin. What blind ambition to try to write a book about that subject matter. And in the most part, Keneally succeeds. But the portrayal of Aboriginal women seemed so one-dimensional, especially in contrast to the insights Keneally showed for Jimmy's own plight as an Aboriginal man. When I read the book, that aspect just annoyed the hell out of me. But I have great affection for the book despite having that reaction, and I have great respect for the author as well, and for this audacity he had in writing such contentious and confronting material at that time. Keneally has since written that he would write the book differently if he wrote it now, if he wrote it at all. But I'm glad he did write it, because it gave me more to think about, more to contend with, a greater slate against which to try to articulate my own views about feminism and the interaction between my gender and my race, and what that meant to me in a contemporary Australia against this particular historical backdrop. Along with A Fringe of Leaves, Keneally gave me a book that provoked me to articulate my own views, providing me with a conversation of depth and intelligence I couldn't find anywhere else within Australian society. This is the gift of a brave, thoughtful, imaginative and uncensored writer. So I think this territory is not off limits, but I think the challenge for writers who want to explore that terrain is that the extent to which one must be familiar with it if coming from the position of the privileged is really great. It's difficult and it's hard. But such is the skill of great writers. They translate, they interpret, and they hold a mirror up. And that is why they are, when they are so talented, so very, very threatening. Thank you. Did we go up here?
And I'm going to very quickly introduce John Burnside, who's now joining us for a discussion following Larissa's lecture. John is as you know, is a prose writer and a poet and a prose writer from Scotland, and his latest book of poetry, Black Cat Bone, won the Forward Prize as well as the T.S. Eliot Prize. So please make him feel very welcome, John. Okay, so John, I mean, would you like to speak to what Larissa said directly? Do you have similar thoughts about, particularly to do with the narratives that have been silenced historically or culturally? And
Yeah, I think what's great is that we've moved away from. I think when we started, I was there at the beginning of the Edinburgh Festival, at the Edinburgh Festival last year, talking about censorship. And censorship is a very 60s word in lots of ways. And I think the move towards talking about silencing and marginalizing is actually one that needs to be done. And perhaps if we'd been choosing a different term, we wouldn't have chosen censorship. We might have chosen, the silencing of writers in the broader sense. I'm interested in one of the things that came up a lot while we were talking about this at Edinburgh and over the year is the way in which writers self-censor. And this is an interest, speaking to what you said about, the weight of evidence which actually alienates the dominant culture and makes the kind of the backlash harder is something that we're all concerned about. And so we move into kind of the area of making judgments about what gestures are, quote, appropriate, i.e. are tolerable, and how not to go too far. I think we should just keep on going too far all the time, as my view. But illustrating that is two stories. One is talking about indigenous people in North Norway, the Sami people there, who were granted a parliament by the Norwegian government and were given all kinds of, cultural rights. They have, you have signposts in the reindeer Sami language up there, and they were given the promise that there would only be one road that went through Finnmarksvidda, because so that the reindeer herding could happen. And then gradually all of that's been eroded. And a few years ago I was there, and it was Grunnlovsdag, which is a national holiday. And Norwegians love waving flags, and this is a great excuse for everyone to go out and wave a flag. And everyone does. And the Sami people come out and wave Sami flags or even Norwegian flags. And that year, a gesture was made, which was that people organized themselves to come out and wave white flags. And this day is always televised, so everyone in Norway saw people from the north waving white flags. And it wasn't about a single issue. It wasn't about mineral rights. It wasn't about the road. It was about the marginalization or the absorption of a whole set of cultural and land issues. And that's one example I think is kind of interesting. The other one is I was watching a movie. I'm working on a book right now which involves, at some point, characters who are involved with Weather Underground. And I was watching a movie which Robert Redford's in this movie, so of course it's got a certain kind of credence and it's mainstream. And I thought, finally a movie which is about weather, made by people who are probably somewhat sympathetic to it. But the first thing that's established in there is that Weather Underground killed someone. Because that's part of the myth, that's part of the dominant myth. Weather Underground were killers. The weather movement never killed anyone. They bombed buildings. They were very, very, very careful to ensure that human beings were not hurt. Another group, in no way related to weather, did bomb a building where someone was killed. That was immediately ascribed to weather, so the mythology goes on. This perpetuation of the myth. We don't live by our history, we live by our mythology. If we live by our history and rather than mythology, nobody would vote Conservative, right? You only vote Conservative because of mythology. And so this myth has to be perpetuated. So even people who are sympathetic to what weather we're about have to include in their narrative, oh, well, we made mistakes, we killed people, that was terrible, and of course the hero in the end turns out to be innocent, etc. But I think that story being told, we have to stick to something that's really fundamentally important, which is to say, we won't self-censor, we won't make that kind of concession to the dominant culture's myth. We will say, this is the truth, this is what happened, this did not happen, what you said happened. So I've gone a bit long there.
No, that's a really excellent point. I mean, this idea of a kind of a vilification or demonization of, say, portraying Weather Underground as terrorists, being used as a way to silence the true story of that kind of cultural movement, political movement. Larissa, does that seem like the sort of thing that mainstream culture here does in terms of demonizing, vilifying people or particular ideas, and then using that as a form of silencing dissident voices?
Well, I think we can think of lots of examples from, children overboard to, if you're against the intervention, you're for pedophiles. If you're for Bill Henson, you're for pedophiles, where that happens. But I think what's really interesting when you have the conversation more broadly, talking to John about these issues, is you realise that those political tricks and semantic tricks, which I tried to give a sample of in relation to the Bringing Them Home report, but which happen in so many other places within Australian political life where there's contention and a particular narrative, are actually universal things. That we can sometimes think these are exceptional unique struggles, and in the historical context they are, but in a global context, this is really just the push and pull of, dominance and subgroup. What is the history we tell about our country, whatever that country is? I think in some ways it's kind of liberating to see it as a global phenomenon rather than an Australian exceptionalism, to see that this, that there is a way that language is used, a way that slogans become popularised, and that is actually a part of winning a particular political agenda or a particular ideological agenda. It's not an agenda about trying to tell truth. And the other thing that I think is really resonates with me about John's observations in this conversation is just from the practice of writing. I think it's often the worst thing that a writer can do is to sit down with a political agenda, to sit down with, a particular thing about what you can and can't write about. I think the best writing always comes from the desire, the absolute passion for the telling of a story. Now, there are things in that story that always resonate with our politics and our experience, which is why we're drawn to it. We're drawn to it for what it represents. We're drawn to it for what it says. But I think that the act of uncensoring as a writer is really important, and you should just write. I think most of us don't self-edit, we don't edit, we just write. And I think that's a really important part of that uncensoring. I always think it's kind of I always get nervous at the compliment, but it is a compliment when people say, when they've read something of mine, they say, gee, that was brave. Because you don't, as a writer, really think about what you think, oh God, what have I revealed about myself? But I think that is the bravest thing about uncensored writing, is you write for the story and the passion. You don't write because you have an agenda. You don't try to construct. It's not propaganda. It is actually just the essence of trying to find a truth. So uncensoring in that way, I think, is a critical aspect of the actual process, the craft of writing.
Yep. I mean, I'm really glad this issue of self-censorship has come up, because to me that's probably one of the prevalent forms of censorship in our, free liberal democracies. One of the things people about the philosophy of liberalism, and going back to ideas of Thomas Hobbes, is that, yes, we're all free to do whatever we want, but we're regulated by fear of what the offence we might cause, of how we might offend the sovereign, which we might get punished, even if the sovereign is not a totalitarian, despotic dictator. So self-censorship is one side of this kind of fear that we have internalized, and I think we all agree that that's something as writers we need to overcome. But there was another kind of censorship that came up in Larissa's talk, which, John, I wonder if you have some thoughts on. And that's something I would call, after the idea of philosopher Slavoj Žižek, systemic censorship. So we have subjective censorship, when writers get imprisoned, tortured, beheaded, and so on. And that still goes on in this world, in many countries, and we should not in any way dismiss that. But in our societies, it seems to me, in addition to self-censorship, there's another kind of censorship. But certain people are not even given the chance to develop the ability to communicate and tell their stories. So that even begins before they're even, given the opportunity to write, or the language to write, or most importantly, the time and the, space to write. Many people they have to work, earn a living. They can't write, they can't make movies, and so on. So that's another powerful kind of censorship, isn't it? Which even prevents the ability to exercise the right to free speech. Do you have any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, well, you're moving in, maybe this thing keeps coming up. We're moving into an area which relates as well to social class, and that's a huge issue, and perhaps we should say, well, we'll do that another time. But another interesting story that comes from another indigenous tradition, and I think it's really important what you were saying, is that I've been hearing, Larissa was telling me, and other people have said, Australians perceive a lot of problems relating to the dominant culture and the indigenous culture as being an Australian problem. I mean, it's just the same problem in, say, Norway. And I did a radio show about Sami culture, the music, basically. Well, actually, it was about the Circumpolar Festival, which the Sea Sami organised in North Norway. And I couldn't see a separation between culture and politics. The BBC said this. Now remember, when you go out there, this is about music and dance and stuff like that. And I thought, yeah, okay, fine, but you can't separate those things from the politics. So we're talking to people about the political aspects, and I got an interview with a Sami artist who Hans Ragnar Mattisson is his Norwegianized name, and we talked about his history, and it was a brilliant interview. And we knew we couldn't put the whole thing into the show, but we wanted to make another show. That material disappeared during the making of the music show, and it was never got back again. Now, Hans Ragnar doesn't give interviews to people on the outside because he doesn't trust them after 1976 with the Alfred Dam controversy, where he was on the run for several years afterwards. But he told his story, and the story is a very similar story to some that you were invoking in your talk. As a child, for his own good, because he contracted a disease which was introduced by the Norwegians, he was taken to Norwegian hospital and then to Norwegian school, taken from his nomadic family and lost contact with them for the rest of his life, and was what they call Norwegianized. That's the term that's used. He was Norwegianized for his own good, because, speaking Sami languages is barbaric. Speaking Norwegian means that you've got access to, the modern world. And so he was taught Norwegian, and his education was in Norwegian. He later trained as an artist. And in his 20s, he suddenly thought, who am I? I speak Norwegian, it's not my language. And the stories of my people, I don't even know them. And so he went back and he taught himself his own culture from scratch. Yeah, and now he expresses that. He made this wonderful atlas, and this atlas he looked at the normal atlas, and it has Greenwich in the middle and New York's here, and he said, okay, let's put, I think it's Kautokeino in the middle, where the Sami, central Sami culture is. That's in the middle of the page, and then the rest of the world goes off around it, and that's how he expresses this. He says, well, why don't I just make my culture the center of the universe instead of the Anglo culture? So this is his inventive way of getting past that. I think the other thing is that it can be rendered very cute if people tell indigenous stories. There's all kinds of nice little cute books you can buy in places like Arizona or Texas, where you have stories about the people who lived there before, and it's a bit like the land that was there before you had Willow Grove Estate. The only thing that's true about Willow Grove Estate is there are no longer any willows there, right? It's the same thing that's true of all the little communities in Arizona, say, where they've got native names, but the people have been displaced. But the people who live in those little villages like to read books about, coyote stories and stuff. And then they've been tamed, they've been reduced to children, usually children's stories. And I think it's important for people retelling stories to retell them with all the energy and the darkness that's in real creation myths, real mythology, real origin stories.
Because it's it's an interesting phenomena too, just because, I spoke in my talk about the handicap of not being able to read and write in English in terms of being able to disseminate a perspective and a point of view. But through that period where Indigenous people were disenfranchised in that way, it didn't mean they still didn't engage in a rich culture of storytelling. As I said, I think it's something that's so human, such an innate part of our human makeup that we tell stories. It's a culturally universal thing. But people just did it in other ways, particularly through song, through music, and through art. I think one of the other issues around the conversation is that often, though the stories are there, they're kind of hidden, and how do you pull them out? It's not necessarily that it's always just about writing them down and disseminating it that way. Aboriginal art always tells an important story about connection to land. It's the whole motivation for it. And it's hard to go into important public spaces or corporate spaces and not see Aboriginal art. And I think a lot of people would look at them and say, oh, that's very pretty, this is very vibrant, the colours are great, but don't actually understand how to interpret what the symbols and the meanings are, or understand the irony of seeing a painting that is virtually a statement about title deeds, connection to country in these, it's a really subversive political thing. So I think there's also a challenge about how those voices get out there. I think that's there's some real challenges about that in Australia, in universities, we'll find that our Indigenous culture and history and literacy courses, writing courses, will be taken by a smattering of Aboriginal students who might be interested, and foreign students, and engaging Australians in those stories can often become a bit of a challenge. And I think that's the other aspect. There is a self-censorship, but there's also a way in which the dominant culture closes its ears. It's not that the stories aren't there, it's about the extent to which people can, you know, find themselves willing to engage with what that perspective has to say. And that's, I think, an even bigger challenge. Storytelling is so inherent, people will always find a way to do it, whatever their tools are. So it's exciting to see people using film or, you know, using visual art or cartoons or whatever to retell ancient stories. But I think the challenge remains about you can't have the conversation unless you've got people listening. And how do you get that engagement, that part of the people self-censoring because they don't want to hear, they don't want to know that history, or they think they know enough, or they think they've heard enough.
But there's a mediation between the story and the listener. And that's what I'm worried about, is people may be listening, but if the mediation is changing or adulterating, if you like, the story, or recontextualizing it, then it can become a completely different thing. It can become a commercial artifact, or it can be, you know, it can become, you know, the background for an advertisement. You know, you get songs from the 60s which were all about trying to stop America from being, you know, doing what it was doing worldwide, and then they become, you know, part of a jeans advert. And, you know, this often happens. And there's this absorption, this process of absorption, which the dominant culture is really good at. And it isn't just absorbing things like, you know, stories, books, music, but it absorbs political ideas. Right now, the tragedy of my lifetime, for me personally anyway, is the absorption of the environmental ecology movement by the mainstream. They have now turned that into, you know, business opportunities and commerce, you know? I liked it better when I was labelled a weird, woolly, hairy-sandaled, what's the right, woolly soft sandaled guy. I never wore sandals in my life, I only bought a pair recently. But I liked it when I was being labelled that much more now than when people are all going about being green, you know? And the people who are being green are people who are making money out of being green, and they're selling us crap, which is supposedly green stuff, like wind turbines, for example.
It goes back to the comment you were making before about the semantics in political debate, and as soon as the dominant culture gets to define something, you can almost guarantee it's the end of it. And the big example here in Australia, I think, is as soon as the government said it's going to put in a policy of self-determination, it was inevitable that that policy would fail, and then the rhetoric would seep in, self-determination's failed. And that kind of wipes out a whole rights movement, a whole political aspiration, and actually something that's actually critical to solving the very problems that they're now saying this thing's kind of contributed to. And so, you know, I agree with you. There's something, as soon as something gets defined, and whether it's censorship or what native title is, what self-determination is, that's when the alarm bells really need to go, because the ability to define it redefines the debate and can often marginalise the very people who... It's one of the most powerful ways of disenfranchising a strong political movement, especially if it's from a subculture or a subgroup within that dominant culture. Alarm bells.
And that's an excellent point. And so another form of censorship we can say is when ideas that are initially contrary to the mainstream are included in the mainstream, but that's another way to actually subvert them and placate those ideas and pacify them, and then again, then maybe use them against those original aspirations. So, look, there's many different kinds of censorship, but one thing we don't want to do is censor the opinions of our audiences. So, I think it's a good time now to maybe take some questions. To begin with, I'd like to ask the delegates of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference if they have any particular questions or comments they would like to make.
As you spoke about so beautifully, Larissa, there's no a question about the role of the writer having this responsibility to tell all the stories. And as we're suggesting at the end of the discussion, it's this issue of how that activity is mediated. And I guess what we're needing to address, aren't we, as you suggested in your talk, is that there's the capitalist economy that is now governing and dominating our educational establishments. As you've already suggested, at universities, certain courses are taken by particular kinds of students. But if we go right back to primary school, there's an element of what is the reading being given to our young children that will provide this education that these folks are talking about. Wasn't really a question, but a kind of joining in bit.
Would you like to comment on that, Larissa?
Well, look, it was more a comment, but I think what it does go to the heart of is that there are, we talk about our roles as writers, but there are actually systemic places where we can be quite influential in mediating, and education is one of those ways. No wonder there's such huge debates about what goes compulsorily on the national school curriculum as opposed to what people might want to study. There's a huge debates about the extent to which you force people to engage in subject matter. But the one thing I would say in terms of some of these issues around education is that one thing that struck me when I've been doing work in terms of preparing materials for teachers to teach is that it's surprising how many teachers would like to teach more Indigenous content. It's not that they don't think the issues are important, but it's that their own education has left them feeling that they are inadequately equipped to teach. They are actually hungry to know more information so that they can do this in a much more respectful, confident manner. There's a huge issue. I often get cross at universities who say, we can't do more about Indigenous education until there are more kids coming through high school into universities, the pool's too small. There's an enormous amount universities can do in relation to teacher education, which they're responsible for. There's an enormous amount they could do in relation to the competencies they teach all of their students. And even if they're not teaching them Aboriginal history and culture, I think one of the remarkable achievements within the medical profession recently is that they make sure that every doctor now graduates with a competency knowing what are Indigenous health issues, and if an Indigenous person comes into your practice, how do you treat them? It's that level of education. It's not all about the history wars and the culture wars. That really tends to demean and minimalise how broad these conversations can be. And I think the extent to which we use education to build capacity within our community amongst our graduates, amongst our leaders is a really important thing. And I think teacher education is so important, not just for the teaching of non-Indigenous kids, but I spoke in my talk about that challenge in the pathway of Aboriginal students not going straight from school to university. And the biggest factor in that, the biggest factor is kids still being told in 2013, you're black, higher education is not something that you should think about. Or you're really clever as a little Aboriginal person, you should think you'll be really able to get a job. It is absolutely shocking to me how much the lack of aspiration still exists for Aboriginal kids. It's not something that necessarily comes from their parents. It's actually much more explained from their pathways through school. Now, admittedly, especially for Aboriginal boys, there's a peer group thing about it not being cool to study. But fundamentally, I think we just let both sides down. We let everyone down because we do not reflect and utilise our opportunities through a structured education system to deal with a plethora of issues. So I think it was a really good thing. I should just say to you, I have to apologise for the reading of my speech. I've got these things on my ears and I couldn't put my glasses on, and I'm getting older and older, and it seems like no matter how big the font is, it's never big enough. So my delivery was a bit clumsy, and I apologise for that.
It was fine. And John, do you want to
Read
talk
my
about
words.
education at all, or and particularly this idea that there's a real responsibility for us? I mean, I'm really glad to hear that, because I'm an academic myself, and I may be teaching some future teachers, which is a pretty frightening idea. But could we do more as writers and as educators?
Can you hear me okay? I've mocked my microphone up. Is it okay? Yeah. I've got a little orange thing here to return somebody after. I always do this. Maybe it's because of my bad education. I was working class, poor working class Catholic in Scotland which is nowhere as severe as an Indigenous kid growing up, but the school system was still going to say to me, when I went to see the careers teacher, the guy said to me, okay, before I could say anything, he said, so there's a career for you in the Royal Air Force. You could learn a trade, and then when you leave the Air Force, you'll have a trade which you can, and I say, whoa, stop. I don't want to join the armed forces. You know, I'm not that kind of person. He said, well, what do you want to do then? I said, well, I'd like to be a stonemason. I was just testing him, you know. I'll be a stonemason. What are the openings for stonemasons? And he said, not so good. But, you know, you could do an apprenticeship in, whatever it was, bricklaying or something, which is, for me, not exactly stonemasonry. But there was that idea of, here's where you can go there. Because this happens to women, to girls in schools, it happens to people of color, it happens to, you know, poor people. And, you know, when I was a kid, it happened to you if you had the wrong accent, really, to some extent. But education does hold certain people back. I teach at St Andrews University, which, if anybody knows St Andrews University, or even anything about Scotland, will know that we're a pretty conservative, upper middle class, mostly, establishment. That's how we're perceived, and that's mostly how we are. Within the university itself, we do a lot to try. We try to do a lot to try and bring a wider demographic in, but the outside world perceives St Andrews as the place that certain kinds of people go to. And so Scots kids don't apply to St Andrews. They apply to Edinburgh, they apply to Glasgow or Aberdeen. They don't apply to St Andrews so often. Working class kids don't. Because again, they've absorbed something which is not necessarily true, but they've absorbed it from the you know, by osmosis, really. One of the things we can do is when we get in, as academics, if we are academics, when we get into the system, we can start rejigging the curriculum. When I arrived at St Andrews, I introduced a course called Literature and Ecology, and we didn't have anything like that. And there were a few courses similar to that in the States, and I think maybe even here, certainly, but not quite the way I was doing it anyway. But I did my own idiosyncratic thing. And to begin with, it was looked as a little bit eccentric, but you know, he's a bit eccentric anyway, so we'll let him do that. And then the sustainable development people started saying, oh, we'd like to send our students to your course because we can make it part of sustainable development. And I said, well, that's great, but the first thing I want to warn you is that one of the things I'll be saying to those students is I don't believe there's such a thing as sustainable development, because development by its very nature is not sustainable. And my basic position isn't even zero growth. And they're looking at me like, you know, maybe we won't send our students to this guy. But actually they come, they ask to come and they come and do the course. And we get some really interesting discussion going. And that extraordinary thing which people think is so common is actually so rare, students from extremely different disciplines getting together and knocking their ideas together, is hugely rewarding for everybody. I think that's the other thing that we do. We put people over here. You're doing law, you're doing medicine, you're doing this. And you're being trained really for a role in the dominant society. And if you aspire to education, if you aspire to doing something better than being a person in the RAF doing electronics, which is fine if that's what you want to do, you're then slotted into a path which leads to a role. And the role is supportive of that dominant culture in some way. I mean, you know, I'm an academic. I'm part of the establishment, aren't I? You know?
Being an academic and a lawyer.
And a lawyer. You're really established.
I know.
A little bit of a change of topic, but related. There seems to be in Australia a kind of thing at the moment, well, it's been going on for a while, about offensiveness. And people don't like to be offended, and they will attack other people because they feel offended. And Richard King's written quite a good article, and I believe he's got a book coming out about it. But surely the role of the writer is not to be afraid to offend. And I think that this is a bit of a danger, and part of that self-censorship thing, and also part of what you're talking about with teachers being afraid to talk about Indigenous issues because they're afraid of saying something wrong and offending people. So can you talk a little bit about that, what your ideas about offensiveness and offending?
I'm really glad you asked that, because it's a complex thing. I mean, there's no simple answer to it because there are different contexts in which things are offensive. And one thing I see a lot of Aboriginal students still struggle with in a university context is the offensive things other students say, especially about their lighter skin. And that is a difficult thing to mediate. And in that sense, I think the aspect of offending from that position of ignorance and really debilitating impact it has on students is a particular context and something that's dealt with differently. But in terms of writers, I think it's a different thing to be offensive because of your own ignorance. It's another to be to not speak because you're afraid you might offend and you're coming from a place of wanting to engage. And I guess one of the reasons why I'm so fond of the chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, even though, I was quite mortified by the one-dimensional nature of the way it's written, is that there's a greater debate that can happen when you're trying to go through the process of sorting out how these things interact to each other when you come from a position of good. And I think sometimes the best learnings we have and the best conversations we have come from when we've tried something and it's failed. We're also a culture that doesn't like to talk about failure, and failure is a bad thing, but I think all of us who've struggled with writing or any other thing know that the failures can be as groundbreaking or as, useful and fertile as sometimes more so. They're more challenging to us. They make us think more. I think that crippling of the people of goodwill not wanting to get engaged has been a very concerning silencing, especially around issues of Indigenous rights, where people don't want to say something because, they're not, if you're concerned that the Racial Discrimination Act has been repealed, but you don't want to say anything because some black people think it's a good thing, but some black people think it's a bad thing, and you don't want to offend the black people who think it's a good thing, or you think this isn't an argument for us, I think you've dealt yourself out of a really important debate about society, because how we treat Aboriginal people in those rights contexts aren't conversations just for Aboriginal people. In fact, we're not the ones who really make the rules. We're 2.8% of the population, if you include our young people. We are the most powerless in these frameworks, and it is the rest of the community who has the bigger responsibility about those rights. So the self-censorship of people in those debates, I think, is almost an abrogation of responsibility if you want to have a debate about what is the kind of country we live in and what are our values. It's absolutely in that context. So those two things, the two instances, are really different, and I have great concerns about that. And look, I think one thing about it that's also been crippling is that there has been for a long time been an us and them thing about Aboriginal people. And I think for even a lot of us like myself who, spend most of our times working on these issues, the goal isn't to keep us an us and them. And for me, I always think, if people say, what's the sort of Australia you like? I'd like to see an Australia where all Australians see Aboriginal culture and history as part of their culture and history. Not something you coexist with, not something that's on the side, but we're all Australians, we all live on this land. And if that's the point we get to, the tentativeness of people being too afraid to go in because they're going to be offended, or too afraid to go in because somebody's going to call them racist, has been debilitating. Because really, often when people are very honest and ask an honest question, coming from a good place, we don't do them any favours on our side if we shut them down and treat it as though it's offensive. The asking of the question is an act of goodwill, and I think we need to have the patience and tolerance to deal with it in that context if it's coming from a place of interest and good and reconciliation. So I'm really glad you asked that, because I think that idea of I can't say anything because I don't want to be offensive in these really important national debates is something that's made us, I think, a little bit poorer in terms of the quality of those debates. We all complain about how it's become so uninteresting and bland in these places, but I think that's because a lot of good people felt silenced and dealt themselves out of that debate.
Look, we're going to push our luck and just ask one more quick question before we end this session. So,
it's a quick question, but it's a long answer.
Okay.
The question was about offensiveness, and what's worried me looking at the civil sphere as a writer and a reader is people who actually love being offended. They need to be offended because their rage at others is what gives them some kind of identity. They have no autonomous identity. They need people to hate, whether it's Indigenous people or Greenies or the left or the right or people in blue ties or whatever it is. They need an other. And so if you look at people reading columns or reading books, they're not reading sensitively and carefully. They're not listening. They're not engaging with goodwill. So it doesn't matter what you say, they will transform it into something that helps them feel better or stronger or more justified. So what I'm asking, this rant was leading to a question. What I'm asking is, can you teach, or can you at least help people to learn how to listen and how to read?
I'm going to have to insist on really short answers to that question, unfortunately. So, John, would you like to?
And this may be slightly tangential, but I think one of the big problems we have right now is the internet and social media, which encourages people to rant on about everything they hate and to spiel out invective, and it becomes addictive, you know. And I write occasional columns, which I'm in my position as basically more or less deep ecologist, but modified in some ways. And I sometimes I never read the responses people make because it's just too depressing. But some people will sometimes quote things and send them to me in emails as if I would be interested. And the level of anger, which has nothing to do with the article I wrote, it just seems pathological to me. And I realize, of course, that then that person's really deeply angry about something else, which has nothing to do with ecology. And I'm afraid that's the problem. And it's a problem that's relevant to the system overall. It is systemic because modern, that's the wrong word, but contemporary consumer society makes people angry. They're frustrated as hell because they're not as successful as they think they ought to be, and that they will never be because they're pursuing something which won't make them happy. So they're angry as hell at everybody who says anything, pretty much. And so they just let out invective. It's probably therapeutic in some way.
Yeah, you kind of feel sorry. I mean, you must have a miserable life if that's how you do it. And I agree. So my answer would be yes and no, because I'm the queen of the long-winded answers. But certainly think in that context that's pathological hatred that's so systemic. I don't know what you do from an outsider's perspective to do that, but I do think that there are elements of that. Of sentiments within the community that aren't as pathological as that we certainly could engage through, effective social media, engaging through education, engaging through great ideas, engaging through the power of story with books and novels, but also, engaging through the power of film and visual storytelling, which is a really powerful thing. I talked about the Bringing Them Home report and, its impact, but you compare that to the impact of Rabbit-Proof Fence as a film, and it's a broader audience, a broader way in which you can engage. So I think as writers, we're storytellers, the power of stories is there is a section of the community whose hatred is driven by ignorance, and being able to connect something that's human within them can always change. That's the power of stories. That's why they're so powerful. Where it's a pathological hatred, nothing's going to get through. It's kind of depressing.
That's an excellent note to end our session on. Power of stories. Thank you. Were you planning this? It was perfect. So, power of stories. I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but please feel free to talk to our speakers after the session. And of course, buy their books at the bookshop. I guess you'll be heading there now to sign books, I assume. But anyway, we'll see you all later. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much.